We all, from a biological perspective, have a mother. None of us would be here if we did not have these women who literally carried us in their bodies and shared with us their life and their breath as we grew and developed and became able to live outside the womb. From a relational point of view, we may have many mothers, several women who came alongside us and also shared with us their life and their breath as we grew and developed and figured out how to live and survive in this world. These women may have been mothers, grandmothers, sisters, aunts, friends, teachers, pastors, bosses, co-workers. They may have been women that we only knew from a distance, and yet they taught us by their example. So this morning, I wanted to highlight some biblical moms and the mothering traits or qualities that they embodied. And some of these women will be familiar to you, and others of them you might not have heard of. We're going to start with probably one of the most well-known moms in the Bible, and that is Mary, the mother of Jesus. And we could talk about a lot of qualities with Mary, but what I wanted to discuss was the fact that she was an awesome cheerleader. And if Mary was a mom today, she would have worn the buttons. She would have packed the snacks. She would have gone to every meet, match, game, concert, and she would have pictures on her phone to show it. Mary was an awesome cheerleader because when someone is behind you 100%, that means everything. So we find an example of Mary being a cheerleader to her son when we read in John chapter 2 about the wedding in Cana. So it should be on the screen, but I'll read ahead or read along with you. The next day there was a wedding celebration in the village of Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the celebration. The wine supply ran out during the festivities, so Jesus' mother said, "They have no more wine." "Dear woman, that is not our problem," Jesus replied. "My time is not yet come." But his mother told the servants, "Do whatever he tells you," which is basically the biblical version of, "Get in there, you got this." The next biblical mother, and I'm going to take my cheerleading jacket off because it's kind of warm in here now. The next biblical mother that we are going to look at shows us the trait of devotion. And this one you might not know the name of. This is Jochebed. Anybody remember her? Probably more familiar with her son, who is Moses. At the time, Jochebed and her husband were living in Egypt with a large population of other Israelites. And the Pharaoh there was afraid that they were going to rise up and take over his country. So the first thing he did was make everybody a slave to take away their potential threat. And then he started looking at how many of them there were. And he's like, when those Hebrew boy babies are born, you just kill them right now. But the doulas, the birth assistants, said, well, they're strong women and they get that done before we get there. So then his second choice was, well, then if you find a boy baby rolling around here, you throw them in the river and get rid of them. And so that's where we are. Jochebed, of course, had a baby boy. And so she did her best, and she hid him for 3 months. Mabel's just a little over 3 months right now, and I can't even imagine where you would hide a baby that is Mabel's size and strength. So at some point, she was not able to hide Moses in that manner anymore, and so she waterproofed a basket, and she put Moses in this basket in the rushes along the river, trusting that God would continue to protect him. And you can read the rest of that story in Exodus 2, but I do want to tell you a little spoiler alert that Moses made it. And I can just imagine, though, that his mother, she was just racking her brain for options, like, what can we do? And there were no options. And how difficult that must have been for her at each step. But she was devoted to Moses, and she was devoted to God. And so she did whatever it took. Our third biblical mom is really a neighbor lady, and her name was Abigail. And she embodies the quality of wisdom. Before David was king, he and his group of mercenaries for hire traveled around the country like Hebrew equalizers. But they had their good side, and they watched over the flocks and the shepherds of a man named Nabal. And when it was time to shear the sheep of Nabal, which was sort of code word for this is a party time, David sent a messenger to remind Nabal how his flocks had remained intact and no one fooled with them or his shepherds the whole time David was keeping an eye on everything. He also suggested through this messenger that Nabal might want to give him a neighborly gift basket of food and supplies as a thank you. And Nabal considered this for about half a second, and he said, "Fat chance, get out of here." Now David, which is the same David who looked at Goliath and said, "Who does this guy think he is?" David was hot. And he called down a curse upon himself that if any man in Nabal's household was still alive the next day, he wanted to be struck dead by God. Fortunately for both Nabal and David, Nabal had a wife. Her name is Abigail, and she stepped in. And we're going to read that story in 1 Samuel 25. Get to my right one here. Verses 18 to 19. Abigail wasted no time. She quickly gathered 200 loaves of bread, 2 wineskins full of wine, 5 sheep that had been slaughtered, nearly a bushel of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 fig cakes. She packed them on donkeys and said to her servant, "Go on ahead, I will follow you shortly." But she didn't tell her husband Nabal what she was doing. She loaded up the donkeys and she went to David. And she called it like she saw it with her husband. And she talked David down from DEFCON 5. And David answers her back in chapter 25 again, verses 32 to 33. David replied to Abigail, "Praise the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you to meet me today. Thank God for your good sense. Bless you for keeping me from murder and from carrying out vengeance with my own hands." Thank God for your good sense, he says. Our fourth biblical mom was a stranger, and she embodies service. This woman was a widow and would have essentially been an unseen nobody in that ancient culture. Without a man in her life, she had no money, no possessions, nothing that didn't come from some sort of charity. And this widow of Zarephath would have been in pure survival mode when Elijah found her. The land at this point had been in a drought for almost 3 years, and God told Elijah to go to Zarephath, and we're going to pick up this story in 1 Kings chapter 17. Then the Lord said to Elijah, "Go and live in the village of Zarephath, near the city of Sidon. I've instructed a widow there to feed you." So he went to Zarephath. As he arrived at the gates of the village, he saw a widow gathering sticks, and he asked her, "Would you please bring me a little water?" And as she was going to get it, he called, "Oh, and just bring me a bite of bread too." But she said, "I swear by the Lord your God that I don't have a single piece of bread in the house, and I've only a handful of flour left in the jar, and a little cooking oil in the bottom of the jug. I was just gathering a few sticks to cook this last meal, and then my son and I will die." Now, I read it really nicely, but there might have been a bit of a side eye and some hand jive that was like, "Do you see me here? I have nothing for you." But instead of walking away, this widow listened and she served Elijah, using her spiritual gift of hospitality. For our fifth and final trait, it was hard to pick just one biblical mom, and you'll see why. Because we're going to talk about being faithful, which has 2 definitions. One definition is that a faithful person is loyal and steadfast, as in keeping a promise. And the second is the more biblical definition, which is being filled with faith in God. So we're going to talk about this trait as it's embodied by 2 women. One is Hannah, and the other is Lydia. Hannah's story is a hard one. She was one of two wives of a man named Elkanah. And every year when the whole group of them traveled to give sacrifices to God, Elkanah divvied up the feast with extra portions for his other wife and all her kids. And Hannah got one because she had no children, which, again, in that culture, no children meant you were nobody. Her husband did not hear the vicious digs thrown at Hannah by the rest of his family. And so when he saw her depressed, he said, well, cheer up. You've got me. Like, what more could you need? One year after the feast, she went off to pray. We're going to read about this in 1 Samuel. I will read quite a bit before it shows up on your screen. We're going to start at verse 9. Once after a sacrificial meal at Shiloh, Hannah got up and went to pray. Eli the priest was sitting at his customary place beside the entrance of the tabernacle. Hannah was in deep anguish, crying bitterly as she prayed to the Lord. And she made this vow, O Lord of heaven's armies, if you will look upon my sorrow and answer my prayer and give me a son, then I will give him back to you. He will be yours for his entire lifetime, and as a sign that he has been dedicated to the Lord, his hair will never be cut. As she was praying to the Lord, Eli watched her, and seeing her lips moving but hearing no sound, he thought she'd been drinking. Must you come here drunk? He demanded. Throw away your wine. Oh, no, sir, she replied. I haven't been drinking wine or anything stronger, but I'm very discouraged, and I was pouring out my heart to the Lord. Don't think I'm a wicked woman, for I've been praying out of great anguish and sorrow. In that case, Eli said, go in peace. May the God of Israel grant the request that you have asked of him. Oh, thank you, sir, she exclaimed. And she went back and began to eat again and was no longer sad. And then verse 19. The entire family got up early the next morning and went to worship the Lord once more. Then they returned home to Ramah. When Elkanah slept with Hannah, the Lord remembered her plea, and in due time she gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, I asked the Lord for him. And then a few verses later, at verse 24, when the child was weaned, Hannah took him to the tabernacle in Shiloh. They brought along a 3-year-old bull for the sacrifice and a basket of flour and some wine. After sacrificing the bull, they brought the boy to Eli. Sir, do you remember me? Hannah asked. I am the woman who stood here several years ago praying to the Lord. I asked the Lord to give me this boy, and he has granted my request. And now I am giving him to the Lord, and he will belong to the Lord in his whole life. And they worship the Lord there. We hold our kids close, and we are responsible for raising them up in the way that God directs. But there comes a time when we have to step back and let God finish the work that he started. Hannah was faithful. She kept her promise, and so did God. And that is quite an example. Our second woman of faith is Lydia, and she was a businesswoman in the city of Philippi during the time of Paul. She's actually the first recorded convert to Christianity in Europe. Her story is in Acts 16, and we'll be at verse 14. One of the women gathered there was Lydia from Thyatira, a merchant of expensive purple cloth who worshipped God. As she listened to us, this is Paul talking, as she listened to us, the Lord opened her heart, and she accepted what Paul was saying. I guess it's actually Paul's scribe. She accepted what Paul was saying. She was baptized along with the other members of her household, and she asked us to be her guests. If you agree that I am a true believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my home. And she urged us until we agreed. So Lydia heard what Paul said about Jesus, and she made an immediate commitment to be a co-worker with Paul, to support and to spread the gospel. This is hundreds of years after the widow served Elijah, and in Roman territory, being a single woman was okay. She could be there unmarried or unchaperoned by her family, and there was no stigma. She was likely well-to-do because purple cloth would have only been purchased by very wealthy people. So her invitation to Paul and his team to come and stay was acceptable, but it was also quite an example of faith. At the time, having a small group meet in her home and talk about God was counter to the culture. because they would otherwise have normally been worshiping the pagan gods or the Roman gods. This could have easily meant Lydia her business if her customers didn't approve of what she was doing. And not only that, but a few verses later, in verse 40, Paul and Silas have been in prison, and they were released. When Paul and Silas left the prison, they returned to the home of Lydia, and there they met with the believers and encouraged them once more. So even after these men were imprisoned, which was a pretty harsh scenario back then, Lydia took them in again. So she was loyal to the cause. She did not yield in the face of any danger to her or her business, and she was full of faith. So we looked at 6 women, some who happened to be mothers to the people that they mothered and helped raise up, and others who weren't. And none of them are mothers to us, and yet we've learned some valuable lessons from them. I alluded to the spiritual gifts of hospitality earlier in the story with the widow of Zarephath. And there are other gifts like these that are mentioned in Romans 12, starting at verse 10. I'm sorry, starting at verse 4. Just as our bodies, am I at the right place? Yes, I'm sorry. Just as it is with our bodies, we have many parts, and each part has a special function. So it is with Christ's body. We are many parts of one body, and we all belong to each other. In his grace, God has given us different gifts for doing certain things well. So if God has given you the ability to prophesy, speak out with as much faith as God has given you. If your gift is serving others, serve them well. If you are a teacher, teach well. If your gift is to encourage others, be encouraging. If it is giving, give generously. If God has given you leadership ability, take the responsibility seriously. And if you have a gift for showing kindness to others, do it gladly. Don't just pretend to love others. Really love them. Hate what is wrong. Hold tightly to what is good. Love each other with genuine affection and take delight in honoring each other. I think you can probably see where I'm going with this. We don't have to be biological mothers to be influencers. In fact, we don't even have to be female. All of these traits that we've talked about today, encouragement, devotion, wisdom, service, faithfulness, these are all qualities of God as embodied by Jesus. And today, as we honor the women who have mothered us, consider who God is asking you to share life and breath with and how. Just had a couple of examples for you. From a personal perspective, you might have heard that I wrote a book. You're probably tired of hearing about the fact that I wrote a book, but I have just been so encouraged by so many people in my life, and that's amazing. We just watched a video earlier about the service Sunday, and just the things that maybe we didn't even think twice about doing, but they are going to mean something big to somebody else. Here's some other examples that I've seen. Spending a few hours serving the community at a mobile food bank. Sponsoring a child living in poverty. Using vacation time to build houses for single mothers in a third world country. Providing a meal to a family in crisis. Taking a kid fishing just to hang out and be a big brother. Sending a card just because. Following the example of seeing past ourselves to love and care for each other is one of the best ways that we can honor the moms in our lives. And by extension, the best way we can honor God as well. So let's pray this morning. I'm going to offer up prayer. Thank you, Lord, for the fact that we're here. You orchestrated this. You planned us before we were even thought of, before we were even born. You knew exactly